Ladies and gentlemen, in this redgamingted.com video, you asked for it, and yes, we're finally doing it. We're going to be taking a look at the Post Mortem analysis of the lighting for Killzone Shadow Fall on the PS4. We're also going to be taking a look at various other aspects of the game, including the recently released developers commentary, which is available. You can just Google it. I'll probably remember to do a link in an article as well. There will be an article up tomorrow with this. It won't be today because it's already fairly late for me, but I'd highly encourage you to check out the article because I will be including all the screenshots that I speak about in the article, along with relevant commentary, plus as well bits and pieces that I've missed, and comparison shots and so forth as well. So I recommend you check that out. That'll be tomorrow, which should be Tuesday, the 4th of June. So obviously, if you're watching it later than that, then the link should be right there in the description. Anyway, enough of such things. Let's take a look at the lighting. So before we jump heavily into the lighting itself, I want to talk to you guys about the developer's commentary. It's fairly short, so there's just a couple of points that I want to touch on. Obviously, this has been recently released, so I wasn't able to go into this on the previous post-mortem video. In case you guys are new or you haven't seen that video, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's on this channel. You guys can just search for Killzone Shadow Fall on the channel search thingy, and you'll be able to find it right there. And also there's an article on redgamingtech.com. I believe currently it's under the most popular, but who knows, if you guys look at this in a month's time, what will be the most popular articles. Anyway, let's get right on with this because there are 4 points that I want to really discuss, and then we're going to move heavily onto the lighting itself. And I'd also like to throw in some of the commentary from Epic, who of course make the Unreal Engine, because obviously they've spoken somewhat about getting the lighting effects working on the PS4 as well, and who knows where we'll end up with this. I'm not sure the length of the time that we're going to be speaking, but I have a feeling it's going to be fairly lengthy, so I suggest you get comfortable. So one of the things that we're going to discuss initially is that when I was watching the developer's diary, which, as I said, you can just Google, they actually mentioned that for the most part, a lot of the, well, pretty much all of the effects, they've actually been able to do them on previous generation systems. Now, obviously, they don't mean at those particular resolutions, because obviously the PS4, they're going to be aiming at that 1080p mark, which is going to be making the title look extremely crisp. But certainly they were able to do certain other things before, including HDR, which is, of course, high dynamic range. We'll go into that further later on. Much high-density particles, loads of characters on screen, great effects with the particles, because obviously just having the particles there, if you're not really doing anything particularly with them, all of this stuff was available. But it turns out that the system itself just had some limitations. We're just talking about memory, we're talking about bandwidth, we're talking about computational power, both on the CPU and particularly the GPU, as it turns out. They just weren't up to snuff, and therefore some of this stuff you could have, for example, it'd be kind of circle a combination rather than circle all of them. But anyway, another point that I'd like to make is that we're discussing once again about the PS4. Now, obviously, they are very, very tightly tied together with Sony, so some of this obviously is promotional work for the PS4. However, they have stated that the PS4 is the easiest platform that they've worked with so far, particularly among the PlayStation brands. And they also said that the day one tool chain was very easy, and the buggers were there right from the day one. We've already discussed some of this stuff on previous videos, but I just want to quickly highlight that. That's very important from a development perspective, because obviously that means that the quicker you are able to just hit the ground running and just get on with things, rather than, why the hell is this code being a slouch on this particular section, or why is it erroring, or whatever. All of that is just important just to be able to make a footnote and say, okay, here's why it's crashing, or here's a piece of sample code, whatever, and it just makes things a hell of a lot easier. Now, moving on from that, they also discussed that there aren't obvious bottlenecks in the system, and then therefore they allows them to focus on the game itself rather than working around the limitations of a system. We've discussed this heavily on the PS3. Specifically, memory bandwidth was a bit of a killer, and the actual fill rate, basically the GPU power of the RSX on the PS3, it wasn't awful or anything like that. I mean, some people really go to town on the sucker, and they basically make it sound like it's, I don't know, a pocket calculator or something, and it's nowhere near that bad. But obviously a lot of the work was being offloaded onto the SPEs of the cell processor, but that's a different story. We're not going to go too much into that anyway. So yeah, there are some development limitations, or at least some coding optimizations that I know they've implemented, and this was mentioned a lot more in my previous analysis video, so I don't really want to retread over old ground, just in case you guys have seen that. But basically it's combination of basically small pixels and memory bandwidth, but as I said, we've already discussed that quite a bit, so we'll go into that in a different video, or you can just check out the other video, shall I say. And finally, this one's a bit of a fun one. They said that the challenge now is being pulled away from, well, struggling with the game development. Now obviously, as the PS4 ages and matures in terms of the hardware, this is going to be less of a thing, because obviously when something's new and shiny, it's a lot easier to just get carried away with it. But obviously in 2 or 3 years' time, the PS4 hardware is going to be a lot more mature, development tools are going to be a lot better, and they're going to be a lot closer to finding out what the limitations are of the system. But for right now, they are just saying that they are enjoying the challenge of making people forget that they're actually playing a game, and indeed focusing upon the, well, just focusing upon the creation of a fun title. Anyway, so we've been now through the developer's commentary, which I think for the most part hasn't told us anything amazingly new, but I just wanted to touch upon it. So let's now focus upon the lighting itself. With the lighting, a lot of the information they have is, of course, actual images, which, once again, just to remind you guys, I'd recommend you check out the article for some comparison shots as well. So I just want to remind you guys what their mission statement and focuses are, in case you either don't know or you've forgotten. Now obviously the game itself is going to be running at 1080p. That's their target, and they want to maintain 30 frames per second throughout all of this. Now in terms of the lighting and so forth, their focus is physically based lighting, physically based area lights, and a rendering pipeline. Now the first thing we have to discuss, of course, with Killzone is HDR, also known as High Dynamic Range. HDR, in case you're not that familiar with the terminology, is a form of lighting. It's also known, just so you guys are aware, of High Dynamic Range lighting. The purpose here is quite simple. It's to have much better details in light and dark areas of an image, and also to be able to better capture those reflections in glass, water, even things such as metals. Obviously these are really important because it helps to add, well, realism to a scene, is basically what it comes down to. For example, things such as, say, a lake in a forest very much benefits from HDR, simply because of the way that, the sun will be able to reflect off of it and interact with the ripples in, say, the pond or whatever. It's also worth noting that it also reduces clipping. Now, all clipping basically is the process of either an area that is either too dark, or conversely, the opposite, too light, basically being clipped to either, well, black or white. And that's obviously really bad because it reduces the range of different colours. In other words, a lot of the subtle shades are lost, and now obviously as well, then you've got those median shades. Now for anyone with something like Photoshop or something similar on your system, you can quite easily start to bugger around with clipping and how it affects things by using something like levels, or even curves is a pretty good one, because you can start to map different images and start to set absolutes of what is black and what is, well, white. Now, this is really important because there isn't just one shade of black or one shade of white. Now, obviously, there is absolute black, right, which is obviously the complete absence of color. This, in case you're wondering, would have an RGB value of 0. So that would be 0 in the green, 0 in the blue, 0 in the red. So in other words, RGB values of 0 in each of the channels. As you start to increase those values, you obviously start to become lighter. And obviously, different values can produce different variances in color. For example, a brightish pink could be something like an RGB value of 228 for red, 0 for the green, and a blue could be 255. Now, I'm sure many of you guys already know this stuff, but I just want to get us all on the same page. So all we're basically talking about here with HDR is a larger range between the minimum values and the highest values. Now, as I said, that alone isn't that particularly amazing, but when you're starting to actually combine the stuff with scenery, and then you start to reflect those lights, and we'll go into that in just a moment, it produces absolutely amazing visual results. Now, honestly speaking, HDR isn't anything particularly new. We've actually had it even being used in, for example, Riven, which was the sequel to Myst, released in 1997, but it wasn't really anything particularly special. Valve then released a demo, which is known as Half-Life Lost Coast. Now, Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, in case you guys aren't that familiar with it, is one of the best examples of what HDR really looked like, especially early on. It actually looked really visually impressive. I'd actually recommend you do some Googling, because there's quite a few images around of showing what the differences are between HDR on and off with Half-Life Lost Coast, and it gives you a good solid base foundation to understand the differences between it, rather than me not wasting time, but me using a lot of time just to explain that. Anyway, then of course Epic started to include that with Unreal Engine 3, which, well, Unreal Engine is obviously extremely important. In terms of Killzone Shadow Fall, they've actually used evolutions of techniques that have been around since Killzone 2, and of course its sequel. That isn't to say that there haven't been improvements over those techniques, but as I mentioned earlier in the development commentary, remember that just a while ago, when I stated that they said that a lot of the techniques, or pretty much all of the techniques they've used previously. Now that's the key. The GTX 780, or 7800, should I say, that was the heart of the GPU power of the PS3, was able to pretty much do all of the same effects, minus one or two things here and there, in terms of the lighting anyway. The difference with the PS4 is that they have the ability to implement much more realistic scenery, not because they weren't able to do the stuff before in terms of one-off, but they were able to combine the effects, and that combination is what is really making the scene look a lot better. Now, in the previous analysis that we were discussing, I was mentioning that one of the biggest things the thing that was vacuuming up, or should I say absolutely destroying the GPU in terms of processing time, was actually the geometry pass. Now, the geometry is fairly simple. I don't really think I need to explain what it is. It's sorry, fly trying to annoy me. But in reality, there are still improvements that they can make in terms of the optimizations for those details, or should I say for the geometry passes. But Guerilla themselves admit in the various papers that they've released that despite the fact that it's actually taking up most of the actual processing power, the actual reality is that it's not contributing towards what actually looks so much better. A lot of it is actually the textures, the much improved textures, which obviously they have many more levels of detail now. as well as the different materials. Now, the different materials are very important, and we'll go into that later on. And of course, the lighting models. Now, in that respect, their changes for their particular engine have a lot in common with Hideo Kojima's Fox engine, or should I say Kojima Productions Fox engine, as well as Unreal Engine 4. And that is a move to physical-based lighting. So what exactly is physical-based lighting? Because it's a big buzzword right now, but you know, you can do a quick bit of Googling and what you find is kind of, if you're a graphic artist, it'll probably make sense, but if you're just someone who just wants to know what it is because you're curious, you're probably going to be there for a while researching. All physical-based lighting is basically a fundamental shift, a tectonic shift actually, from how we conventionally saw lighting done a couple of years back to how it's being done now. In actuality, back in the day, certain light sources, not light sources, I'm sorry, certain reflections, certain objects basically that were used in the scene all had light sources automatically applied to them. Now, that's not to say that that was awful for the time, but the problems with that are obvious and inherent. Firstly, it's a pain in the ass to start changing those different lights, or changing how bright they are in relation to the scene, or to say the sun that's moving and so forth. It's not really dynamic, it's not really interactive. The other problem with that, of course, is that you start to create sometimes a bit of a visual disparity between the different light sources. So in other words, something may be a bit too bright, something may be a bit too dark, or maybe not quite the right shade, that type of thing. And this very much plays into shadows as well. In their own PDF, they actually mention that it makes it a lot easier to achieve hyper-realism / photorealistic looks, simply because the objects themselves much better mirror what you would really expect something to do, and also allows a consistent look in different HDR environments. So in other words, everything looks how it should. It's also much more simple for the artists themselves. It allows a lot easier to simply troubleshoot issues and extensions of the color space or lighting and so forth, and also allows much more simpler material interface selections and so forth as well. This also implements two physical based systems, the first being physically based shading models, and the second being physically based lights, which we've spoken about briefly, but we'll go into in depth more later on. So the actual physical based shader models basically allow for a much more consistent look. They are responsible primarily to how a material, because everything is material, whether it's a character's skin, to, I don't know, a bottle, to a tabletop, all the way down to the barrel of your gun. They will basically respond differently under different circumstances. So, for example, whether we're in a very bright, say, desert type of terrain, and obviously you will see the light sourcing have different colors, all the way down to if you're in, say, a jungle area where it's darker and you're seeing just maybe the odd ray of light through the trees, or maybe you're going through a forest in, say, a horror game, and say the only lights you've got are, say, the lanterns surrounding you. Or, for example, it could even be like an office complex, and you can imagine how many different reflections would be in an office complex, especially if you're going to one of these more modern glass tower kind of looks. So, obviously, it's not just a case of all objects reflect things in the same way. For example, let's say you were to have two cups on a glass desk. And you would say have a desk lamp there. Let's say one cup would be one of those ceramic type of white cups, you know what I mean, the cheapy kind of ones that everyone's got lying at the back of their cupboard, or are pretty much littered around most offices, or one of the nicer glass cups that you can get. I've certainly got one. It's slightly tinted. It's like a kind of a dark shade of glass to better be able to provide withstand the heats of, say, boiling hot liquids, say coffee or whatever. Now, obviously, it doesn't take a particular genius to know that if you're shining either light through those particular cups, and let's even assume just for a moment that those cups are empty, you can imagine that not only the color of the light going to behave differently, but the actual way the light is going to move around is going to be extremely different as well. Now, if you were to then move those exact cups, or better still, if you were to just imagine that that changes to, say, a marble table, you can imagine how, say, the lighting would work there. And this is basically what all this means. It means that the materials will basically be able to better interact with one another, and the programmers don't have to worry about so much stuff. They basically have to set it and forget it. Obviously, I'm simplifying some of this stuff for the purposes of this video, but I think you guys are smart enough to understand where I'm roughly going with it. Now, I did promise you guys a little bit of a diversion halfway through this video, didn't I? And I was going to make some comparisons with Unreal. Now, the Unreal Engine 4, and obviously there have been two. One really impressive one, in my opinion, was the Elemental demo. Most specifically because of the lighting. Now, the lighting on Unreal Elemental demo was heavily using, for the PC version, SVGOI. Now, you may remember that initially there were... Oh, by the way, guys, I've done a comparison video on this, so you can check it out if you've not already done so. But it's got so many views, I'm assuming most of you have already seen it. But, you know, if you've not, go ahead and do so. You can search for Elemental demo, and there's PS4 versus PC, and you can go ahead and check it out to your heart's content. But anyway, getting back to the actual purpose of the video... Epic originally were focusing heavily on SVGOI. Now, bear in mind that the demo itself was actually running on a NVIDIA graphics card. That would be the GTX 680, which has significantly more grunt than the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One GPUs, although obviously the PS4's GPU kind of laughs over the Xbox One, sorry, Xbox fans, but it's true. It has more computational power, as I've mentioned before. So yeah, but recently Epic have been somewhat, I wouldn't say dicey, but they've been somewhat reversing their position on SVGOI. Now, one of the reasons for this is because they're actually saying it's an extremely expensive lighting method. Now, what the hell does expensive mean? I hear you scream. Well, expensive is just mostly to do with inefficiencies, or what they're citing to be inefficiencies. This is primarily the fact that, well, it takes a hell of a lot of computational power to, well, render. Now, PC gamers aren't particularly happy about this, and indeed, Epic themselves actually made some posts on this on their own forums for developers and various other bits and pieces. Once again, I'm not going to bother to give links to this stuff in this video because I would be here forever and a day making annotations and it would just be pointless. So once again, I will be doing all of this in a article tomorrow. It will be, you know, tomorrow/Wednesday at the very latest, but most likely going to be tomorrow. But I'll read a small excerpt of the quote. On the other hand, using pre-computed lighting where you don't need dynamicness frees up a lot of processing power. The Infiltrator demo that we saw released at GDC leverages this heavily. In short, we would have had to scale down the Infiltrator massively without pre-computing some of the lighting. There are over 1,000 lights in some of the scenes, and about half of those cast shadows. Dynamic shadows have a huge cost on graphics hardware, but pre-computed shadows are very cheap. Our general purpose reflection method, reflection environment, also relies on pre-captured probes. By having the general purpose reflections method be cost efficient, we were able to spend the extra GPU time on screen space reflections, which provide extra details where it is available due to screen space limitations. Now there are some workflow costs to pre-computed lighting. and this is something we hope to improve significantly in the future. And then he closes off by stating, pre-computed lighting is already useful for scaling down to low-end PCs, 60 frames per second, mobile, and so forth. Now, as far as what we understand from interviews and so forth, there was absolutely no way the PS4's GPU could be able to handle that level of complexity. It was just too much. Bear in mind that even a GTX 680, which is significantly faster than the PS4, would struggle with that because, it's next generation now. CryEngine actually does have some level of dynamic global illumination. However, with CryEngine 3, the light propagation volume is far less advanced, and it can only actually bounce off of one source, and the sun is the only source. Only GI source. Now, based on, we're going to continue on. Now, specular lighting. Now, dominant part of the visible lighting, every material exhibits specular lighting. It will be angle dependent, obviously, because there's no point in lighting looking the same if you're from different angles. That just looks, well, crap. And obviously it will be material type dependent as well. Now, all of these are extremely important. Now, all of the different materials can handle both diffuse and specular lighting simultaneously, might I add. This increases the realism of the objects massively. I know what you're gonna ask. What the hell is diffuse and specular lighting, and what is the difference between the two? Well, I am here to explain. I'm going to be doing a lot more explanations, by the way, in the article. This isn't a cop-out, by the way, to get you guys to look at the article for any other reason than explaining the stuff verbally is pretty much very difficult. I could try to sync stuff in combination with my voice in terms of images, but I would be here for far longer than what it would take for me to write an article, and to be honest with you, I'm not going to spend, the next 5 hours editing, so it's not efficient at all. So, yeah. I will be, however, putting out the article, and you guys can see the difference, and you will have all of the links so you can peruse them at your proverbial leisure. Anyway, to give you guys the wiki definition of diffuse reflection, diffuse reflection is the reflection of light from a surface, such as an incident ray is reflected at many angles rather than just one angle, as in the case of specular reflection. An illuminated ideal diffuse reflecting surface will have equal luminance from all directions which lie in half space adjacent to the surface. Lambiantin reflectance, I'm sorry. Well, I'm done. I'm sure you guys understood that. No, just kidding. So, what in the balls does that mean? Light rays that are directly from a light source and then hit an object and then will reflect from your eyes, or into this case, the screen, are basically a reflection directly of that light source, and that would be known as a specular reflection. You could think of them as very harsh lighting. In the natural world, this would be something like, say, sunlight. Or, for example, you could maybe have a torch or a flashlight if you're in the States. That type of thing. I think you guys get the idea. You can also imagine this, for example, you would take a flashlight and you would put it towards a, say, mirror. And that, my friends, is specular. So, what the hell is a diffused light? Well, this is where it becomes a bit more tricky. Isn't that just what you want to hear? Well, diffused is simple. Diffusion is obviously where the beam of light, once again, let's just take, say, a flashlight hits a diffused surface, and that beam will then be reflected in various different directions based upon the surface contours of that object. And that's very important, because remember how I was discussing earlier on that, well, the surface material matters? I wasn't kidding. So, for example, you can assume that something like glass itself has many different materials, doesn't it? You have the smooth glass, you have more ridged glass, you have, say, a bottle type of glass, you have multiple different bottle types of glass, of course, and so on and so forth and so forth. So that's really where, well, that's pretty much the difference. Now, in reality, of course, you need a mixture of those, because you don't quite know, well, objects obviously in real world are lit in multiple different ways. It could be a case of, say, sun on the gun that you are holding, but then it could be, say, small pieces of light from, say, another person's gun that is next to you, and obviously the muzzle flare would be reflecting off of your gun versus, say, let's say, for example, we're on a tiled floor. So let's say, for example, you're in like an office building with a tiled floor. You can imagine that the direct sunlight is coming through the window, and obviously that sun is changing in different directions. It's coming in through the window, and obviously perhaps even the blinds are making a slight alteration on the way the shadows are playing. Then you can imagine that, say, you are shooting your gun, and your teammates are also shooting their gun, but all of this stuff has to make sense in the world of lighting, and therefore that is why importance of lighting. A lot of this stuff, of course, depends upon the roughness of the particular surface in question. It's also worth noting that a lot of the stuff can also do what is known as self-shadowing. What the balls is self-shadowing? Well, self-shadowing would be very simple to explain, actually. Imagine you have pits on a surface. Well, those surface pits will obviously create their own shadows, and obviously if the lighting itself, if the object is lit itself through whatever means, then, well, there you go, self-shadowing. This means that the materials themselves for Killzone Shadow Fall will work in any environment. So in short, the purpose of this is that if you were to take an asset and you were to create that asset for a jungle at night, and then you were to drop that into an urban environment, or you were then to drop that into, you know, the bottom of a swimming pool during the middle of the Sahara, obviously those are all completely different scenarios, some of them realistic, some of them not so much, but the purpose is that those materials would have their own lighting present, and they would be able to interact naturally with the other lighting that is surrounding that scene, and that's very important. And this allows a workflow of basically setting three main parameters, which would be the albedo, the roughness, the specular reflectance, which we've gone through, the material's actual response to that, and then that's decoupled from the lighting, the main lighting, of course, and it will work in any light environment. And then all they have to do is review assets in different IBL and then lighting environments. So the materials themselves are measured values for most materials, and these are actually swatches almost that they can choose from. Indeed, they actually provide them as Photoshop color swatches. Every material can be roughly defined by the parameters and the base for hand-painted textures as well. Indeed, in the documentation, they even give a use case. A material would be an old iron plate covered in paint, covered in paint and scratches and bullet holes and rust. And they basically apply many different textures, for example, titanium, chrome, nickel, and so forth, and then they amplify those with the rust and the lighting. They actually even state in their documentation that it was a big step for the studio, and the artists themselves had to adapt to this technology because of just how much of a step forward it was. And they actually had to start attending training and workshops and actually start teaching themselves how to better implement the stuff. As well as all of that, there was a focus on production and quality. That was the win. That was what they were really going for here, to make this look like a title that wasn't just, oh, this is the next generation. They wanted to be like, this is the next generation. This is how games on the next generation should look, should function, and should feel. And this allowed them to create a pretty interesting reflection system. And there's actually a 3-tier reflection ray trace system. Real-time glossy reflections, localized cube maps, and finally the skybox. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all she wrote for this particular video. As I've said, some of the stuff will be much better served tomorrow in an article, and it will be a fairly extensive one. I have a feeling it will probably shift to a couple of pages. Of course, I will provide all relevant links, including to some development zones, to Epic Games, to various white papers and various other bits and pieces. Lighting is an absolute huge topic. And this video is a brief overview of what they've focused upon. Honestly speaking, I could be here for another hour to 2 hours explaining all of this stuff, but some of it, as I've mentioned, is better in a visual medium, and so it would be a hell of a lot easier to do some of the stuff via an article. It will be up tomorrow/Wednesday, most likely tomorrow, which will be Tuesday, or if you want a date because you are that way inclined, that would be the 4th of June, he says as he looks at his computer clock. That would be the 4th/5th of June, most likely the 4th. So you can check that out either by going to the description below, or you can just go to redgamingtech.com, depending on when you've watched this. Obviously, it's just within the last couple of days, then you can just easily get to it. If not, then you may want to go to the description. Regardless, there will be a hell of a lot more stuff upcoming on this channel. Will be a really in-depth look at the AMD Jaguar, which we'll be discussing performance, and that will be compared to various Intel CPUs as well as AMD. We're talking low power and high power devices here. We're also going to be taking a further look at the PS3. I know, why not? Because there's still some stuff that we need to clarify on regards to the cell processor. We're also going to be taking a look at part 2 of both the Xbox and the PS3's kind of look back through time, and we've got an absolute ridiculous amount of other tech stuff coming up as well. Obviously there are some reviews that I'm a bit behind on. I'm supposed to have done Dirt, but I haven't had time. I myself am in the planning stages for a new PC. I'll be buying most likely a Haswell-based setup in the next month or two, depending. I'm waiting for prices to settle somewhat, as they're fluctuating all over the place because there's the good old price gouging that everyone likes to do on the first couple of weeks of launch. So I'll probably be doing a full system review of that. I'm still ironing out a few of the finite details, exactly what system specs we're going to be going for. And of course, we're also going to be doing further in-depth analysis of some of the other bits and pieces on the systems as well. And there's also some stuff on the Wii U coming up as well, including information on system reserved RAM and the operating system itself. And we're going to be doing some more tips and tricks regarding Windows operating systems as well, because I haven't been doing that much PC related stuff, and that is going to be changing quite significantly actually. So anyway, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming up, and I can only hope you will stick around with me to enjoy it. I am going to get going, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and well, take care and bye for now.